أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له له الحمد وله الملك يحيي ويميت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير وأشهد أن محمدًا عبد الله ورسوله وصفيه وخليله أرسله الله للناس نذيرا وبشيرا محمد رسول الله والذين معه أشداء على الكفار رحماء بينهم لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة لمن كان يرجو الله واليوم الآخر وذكر الله كثيرا أوصيكم ونفسي أولا بتقوى الله وطاعته وأحذركم من عصيانه ومخالفة أمره أما بعد فإن خير الحديث كتاب الله وأحسن الهدي هدي محمد وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة. Brothers and sisters, committed Muslims, I'd like to begin by extending my gratitude to the organizers here for giving me a chance to share some thoughts with all of you today about the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And secondly, I'd like to congratulate our brothers and sisters and the shuhada from the Islamic Republic of Iran for 38 very difficult years that they have survived through. And not only have they survived, but in many senses of the word, they have led. For the Muslims of the world, especially the Muslims here in the United States, this day is our Independence Day. Even though many of us may consider ourselves to be Americans, July 4th cannot be considered to be our Independence Day. The inception of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, that marked the beginning of our independence. And so once again, I'd like to extend my congratulations to the brothers and sisters who launched that revolution and who are working very hard to ensure its success. The topic that I was given today in regards to any comments I would make about the Islamic Revolution in Iran concerns the rejection of modern slavery. It appears that the obvious implication of that particular topic is that slavery today is more mental than it is physical, more economic than it is direct. But if we were to take a look at all of human history, perhaps with a greater focus on the last 1,000 to 1,500 years, aspects of this kind of slavery have always been around, whether in the mental form, the physical form, the economic form, what have you. Debt slavery has always been accompanied by a sort of physical slavery. And so I'll try to tailor my comments around the guidelines of this topic, though I may not use those words exactly. But nonetheless, insofar as an occupation of the mind is concerned and how it leads to an occupation of the body, that is germane to the Islamic Revolution in Iran and how it has liberated the spirits of the people, and thereby it has liberated them from physical bondage. If I was to be given an elevator test and somebody was to ask me to describe the Islamic Revolution in Iran in one sentence, I would say that the Islamic Revolution restored the Islamic identity. And then obviously, having said that, the person would ask me to explain, what do you mean by that? And so the rest of my talk is going to be about the meaning of that expression. So let us start with the three operative words there: restore, Islamic, and identity. And what do I mean by that? Now, as far as the word restore is concerned, what we mean by that is resuscitate, revive, reinvigorate, give new life to. And so that means that the Islamic identity never died. It was always there, and it's gone through fits and starts, and it's gone through ebbs and flows. And so before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, there was a certain geopolitical situation. And after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, there was a different geopolitical situation. And if I can go back to February 11th, 1979, and perhaps even the few years before that, the Cold War was still at its height. The world was divided into a first world and a second world. The first world obviously being the West, led by the United States and perhaps a couple of countries in Europe. And the second world was the so-called communist world, which was led by the Soviet Union or the USSR. As far as the Muslim East is concerned, to the east of Islamic Iran is Pakistan. And in 1978, Pakistan itself went through a military coup. And in 1979, it was just coming out of that military coup, and the former prime minister who was overthrown in that coup would be hanged in the following year. And to the west of the Islamic Republic, of course, were Iraq and Syria. And both of them at the time were dominated by the Ba'ath Party. In Iraq itself, Saddam Hussein was sort of being coached into the military dictatorship position by the CIA. As far as Syria was concerned, it was an unelected, repressive regime, military regime. And it was also dominated by a certain version of the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath is, in a sense, is an Arabic incarnation of, or an Arabic version of socialism. And the socialist aspect of the Ba'ath Party was more dominant in Syria than it was in Iraq. To the south of the Islamic Republic was, of course, Egypt. And Egypt had become, in 1978, a card-carrying member of the imperialist Zionist axis in the world with Camp David. At home, of course, Anwar al-Sadat, who happened to be the president of Egypt at the time, had inherited the legacy of Jamal Abdel Nasser in decimating and butchering the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood. And much of the same kind of activity was going on in Syria. In Iran itself, before it became, quote unquote, Islamic Iran, with the return of Imam Khomeini, after the Shah had left, the imperialist axis decided to choose its own man to establish a caretaker government, or to be the head of the caretaker government, or the interim government, with the latter government to be decided under the control of this interim government and the sponsors of it, the interim government, which happened to be the United States and, in the background, Zionist Israel and a bunch of other countries. At the time, Iran was considered to be sort of a satellite of the First World. It happened to be sort of a proxy of the United States. It was sort of providing cover for the United States to spy on the Soviet Union. And so, insofar as this interim government was concerned, the head of that interim government was chosen to be a one Shapur Bakhtiar. That name may ring a bell to some of you. This was not sort of an incidental or a coincidental choice. It was a very well-considered choice, something that a choice that was expected to get the support of the people, because during the time of the Shah, this Shapur Bakhtiar, who was the interim prime minister, he was against the Shah, and he had been to prison several times for his in regards to his opposition to the Shah. And so the Brain Trust in Washington and in other parts of the world, they figured that they would fool the people, and they would choose a secularist like Shapur Bakhtiar. And so they felt that it could be like a seamless transition from a monarchical rule to, what might be considered loosely representative rule. And I guess it needs to be said that one of the kind of system that this person, Shapur Bakhtiar, favored is a so-called constitutional monarchy, if that makes any sense. It seems to me to be an oxymoron, but nonetheless, that's the kind of system that he favored. Suggesting in a sense that, he would have a Shah as a figurehead, and then, in an opposite sense, that the people would be running the show from behind the scenes, much like the British monarchy. And so, as far as the Islamic Revolution is concerned, it was important to have a scholar and a very politically astute individual like Imam Khomeini in charge. And so his position was that as far as the people of Iran are concerned, the Muslim people of Iran, that they have rejected the system that was oppressing them and dominating them. And thus any appointments made by the representatives of that system must by necessity also be rejected. And so he said that we didn't choose this person, Shapur Bakhtiar, to rule in Islamic Iran for a week, for a day, for a month, for a year. We didn't choose him. The people, they have made their choice. And so when we rejected that system, we reject also all of its decisions. Now, insofar as Imam Khomeini is concerned in the decisions that he made in the very beginning, what it did is that when he came back to Iran, Islam burst onto the scene. It was sort of like an explosion that took place in the media. And what I mean by that is that by rejecting the interim government, what he was saying, and of course, you know, these statements, they came out as slogans much later, that we want neither East nor West. We want neither communism nor capitalism. We are neither a member of the first world nor a member of the second world. In fact, we are establishing a new world. And many of you may remember that when he came back to Iran on this day 38 years ago, he was 80 years old, or he was 79 years old at the time. And, you know, just look around you. How many 80-year-old people do you know that have this level of vitality, this level of conviction, this level of awareness, this level of sensitivity to the needs of his people, this level of a sense of urgency, this level of a sense of purpose, this level of a sense of direction. And it was this kind of man that was needed, because the Muslims in Iran, even though they had overthrown the Shah, they still did not have the sense of self that they have today. They were falteringly and haltingly taking steps forward. And in a sense, you could say that they were taking 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. But with these initial policy decisions, some things happened immediately. There was an immediate lifting of the fog. There was an immediate clarification of issues. And one thing that was clarified almost immediately is that the combination of racist religion, religious racism, exceptional religion, religious exceptionalism, all of that came out of the closet, and it was found that all of them belonged to one group. Al-kufru millatun wahida, it's a hadith of the Prophet. That kufr is one denomination. And so all of what I just said, all those fancy words, what it means that Anglo-Wahhabism, imperialism, and Zionism, they were all found to be one ummah. They were in one direction, and Islamic Iran was going to take a new direction. And so the clarification that took place is that the world was immediately divided into 2 different directions. The first of these was the exclusivism and the racism that is represented by Banu Israel or Israel. And the second direction is the inclusivism and the universalism that is represented by Islam and its leading advocate, Islamic Iran. Everybody else in the world, including the United States, is a bit player. And if you don't understand this reality, and believe me, in 1979, Imam Khomeini not only understood this reality, but he broadly communicated it in every speech that he gave. We have enemies, and we have leading enemies. He called the United States a Shaitan al-Akbar, but his foreign policy was geared towards the liberation of Palestine. What does that tell you? He realized that the United States is the muscle that promotes the Zionist program. And so, one of the key decisions that he made, one of the most strategic decisions that he made, is that Islamic Iran is going to have a strategic foreign policy that targets the liberation of Palestine, the liberation of the Holy Land. And brothers and sisters, we have to understand what this means. We have to understand the difference between a strategic foreign policy and a reactionary foreign policy. When we talk about a strategic foreign policy, we are talking about a set of key decisions that shape all of our other decisions. Every other country in the Muslim world, in fact, most countries in the world, have a reactionary foreign policy. They wait for the power players in the world to do something and then they react to it. But Islamic Iran, under the leadership of Imam Khomeini, took a different direction. It took heart with regard to its responsibility to lead. This cannot be underemphasized. It took the responsibility of leading to heart, and thus it inspired a strategic foreign policy, which was the liberation of Palestine. And the reason I'm suggesting that we really have to understand this, it's because, as I said, the foreign policy of most Muslim countries, majority Muslim countries, is reactionary. And part of the criticism of Islamic Iran has come to people who are used to reacting to what the power players in the world do. And because they are used to reacting to what somebody else does, when they see Islamic Iran acting in a strategic fashion, they filter it through their reactionary mechanism. And thus comes their criticism of Islamic Iran's policy in Syria. Islamic Iran's policy in Syria is strategic, not reactionary. Islamic Iran is the one who has built the axis of resistance. From Iran all the way to Lebanon. Now throughout this axis, there are not a whole bunch of Imam Khomeinis. But nonetheless, Islamic Iran has to deal with the representatives of the people in these countries. But it has maneuvered all of them into a direction where their primary foreign policy objective is the liberation of Palestine. And again, this is key to understanding what I mean when I say that the Islamic Revolution restored the Islamic identity. Islamic identity is not something reactionary. It is something strategic. It is something that forces other people to react, while Muslims don't react. Muslims are proactive. We act, but we don't act in a way to dominate other people. We don't act in a way to occupy other people. We act in a way that gives them the sense of liberation and independence that we experienced when we became Muslims. And so now I return to my opening statement that the Islamic Revolution restored the Islamic identity. And so what do I mean by Islamic? Obviously, we live in a world where that term Islamic or Islam, it really depends on who's using it. And insofar as the world's media is concerned, we aren't the producers, we aren't the directors, and so they're giving Islam any definition they want. And so when we talk about Islam, it behooves us to try to really understand what we're talking about. Again, before the Islamic Revolution, Islam, it was an afterthought. As a civil society, as a body politic, as something that has military force behind it, people didn't talk about Islam that way. Sayyid Qutb had, again, a great tragedy. About 11 years, 12 years before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, he was hanged in Egypt. Maulana Maududi, the head of Jamaat Islami, he would only live for another year after the inception of the Islamic Revolution. He died here in the United States, I believe, in 1980. The head of Hizb ut-Tahrir also expired around the same time. And so a lot of the intellectual cache of the Ummah, other than in the brain trust of Islamic Iran, had expired. But then the Islamic Revolution took place. And after it took place, for the past 4 decades, people can hardly talk about anything else other than Islam. It's in political cartoons. It's in the social culture. You know, whether they make fun of it or whether they're trying to figure out ways to defeat it. But you could say, in a sense, over the last 4 decades, the dominant topic in the world's academia, in the media, in military strategies, is what to do with this Islam. Militaries are poised against it. Think tanks are dedicating resources to figure it out, to defeat it. Movies are made about it. Muslims are represented in a whole host or scores of different stereotypes, all the way from terrorists to Sufis. And so, as far as the world is concerned, this may not have been the intent, but after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, everybody wants to know about Islam. And so that makes it a seminal event in history. Again, it's very important for us to recognize that when we're talking about the meaning of the word Islamic. So what do I mean by this term Islamic? And so in order to get a better idea of what I mean, let's refer to the Quran. And let's compare it to the way that we communicate in English or in a variety of other Western languages. The Quran has no uppercase and lowercase letters in it. When we write in English or we communicate in English, you see a book, the beginning of a sentence, the first letter is always uppercase. Or you have a proper noun, the first letter of the proper noun, like the name of a city, the name of a book, or name of a town, name of a person, the first letter is always capitalized. It's in uppercase. The name of an organization is written in uppercase. All abbreviations are written in uppercase. Suffixes like Mr. and Mrs., this is all written in uppercase. But the Quran has neither uppercase nor lowercase letters. It only has one case. And the reason that this is germane is because of how this originated in the Western languages. If you go back into the study of written language, especially as far as the Western world is concerned, you go back to Latin, for instance, everything was written in uppercase. And most of the written communication was meant for the nobles, for the princes, the kings, the emperors. This is before the time of the church. But it was discovered by the scribes that to write, all in uppercase letters was a little bit difficult, and they couldn't do it with great haste. So if a communication had to be printed in great haste, then, it took them a long time to compose everything, in those letters, which at that time were all uppercase. There was no lowercase at the time. And so some of these scribes, they came up with sort of what you would call a longhand cursive writing style, which combined the letters together, or in a sense, so that one letter would flow into another letter. And so it was easier for them to write communications in these so-called lowercase letters, where they could easily connect one letter to another one. And so what ended up happening is that the forms of writing in these lowercase letters was mostly reserved for the commoners. And any time something had to be written for the nobles and the so-called upper classes, everything would be written in the uppercase letters. And so you can see that there is some classism and exclusivism which is creeping into the language. And so then you fast forward perhaps 1,000 years when the church is dominant in Europe. And the writing technology had progressed quite a bit. And there were people, monks, who were, sort of paid scribes to write down the scriptures. And so as the technology of writing improved, and the substrate that you wrote on, paper for instance, as all of that improved, and the inks improved, what ended up happening is that words like God, words like the name of a king, or where the city that the nobleman was staying in, all of these would be written in all capital letters. And then the rest of the script would be written in the lowercase letters. And there's some languages in Europe even today that, in Germany for instance, that all nouns are written where the first letter is capitalized. And so again, I reiterate that insofar as the language itself is concerned, I know that we never think about this, but it's important for us to think about it as we begin to look at the Quran. And I'm going to make a very important point here in a second. So there is a degree of classism, exclusivism, racism, betterism that's creeping into the language. And so again, I reiterate that in the Quran, there are no cases. There are no uppercase letters. There are no lowercase letters. And so now we look at the term Islam, and we try to analyze a certain ayah in our mind. اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي وَرَضِيتُ لَكُمُ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا. On this day have I perfected for you your social pattern, your social convention, your deen. I'm just translating the ayah. And I have maximized my favor upon you. And I have satisfied myself that Islam is your deen. Now, you look at the translations of the Quran, you may have them in this masjid, and just look anywhere. That when it says, when the translation says that I have satisfied myself that Islam is your deen, in most translations you'll see capital I, S-L-A-M. In most English translations, that's how you'll see it. But that's not what the Quran says. The Quran has no upper and lower case letters. The word Islam has a meaning. You can't present the word Islam and therefore the concept of Islam like you present Christianity and Judaism. Islam, the word itself, has a meaning. And so if you're translating all the other words in Arabic, why do you maintain Islam in an Oriental fashion by capitalizing the I and then representing the rest of the word that way? Islam itself means self-surrender, a voluntary conformity to the authority of Allah. And so when Allah says that I have satisfied myself that Islam is going to be your deen, what he is saying is that I have satisfied myself that self-surrender unto me is going to be your deen. And so when we talk about Islamic, within the context of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, there was a geopolitical situation before the Islamic Revolution, and there was a geopolitical situation after the Islamic Revolution. There was a representation of Islam before the Islamic Revolution, and there was a different representation of Islam, the correct representation of Islam after the Islamic Revolution. The seismic shift that occurred is that Islam went from an Islam of rituals to an Islam of involvement, to an Islam of centrality, to an Islam of leadership. That the Muslims were no longer going to be absent from the way that the world functions. The Muslims are no longer going to be absent from setting directions for humanity. And if I could put these words in sort of a more academic sense, what happened before and after the Islamic Revolution in 1979 can be captured by the following distinction. And that is the relationship between the men of God and truth on the one side, and the men of power and the church on the other side. We have to try to understand what is meant here. When I say church, that's inclusive, it's a generic term again, it's inclusive of masjid, church, synagogue, temple, etc. Imam Khomeini was a man of God, and thereby his ultimate objective was the dissemination of truth in society and in the world. Men of power have different objectives. Men of power have the objective of concentrating wealth and expanding their power base. And it is very easy for them to use conciliatory men of the church, meaning priests and imams and ministers and and rabbis and what have you, to get a veneer of endorsement by God, because the priest is endorsing their actions, to go out and do whatever they do in the world. And hence, before any U.S. president goes to war, he invites a slew of preachers and priests to come to the White House to bless whatever invasions and occupations the United States is going to engage in. And of course, they give it, the human rights and the democratic veneer and all that stuff. So again, when we talk about the term Islamic, we have to understand that those men who are representing this notion of Islamic are men of God who have a relationship with the truth. They're not men of power who have a relationship with the church. Okay, and again, go back to our statement from the very beginning that the Islamic Revolution restored the Islamic identity. And so now let's talk about the issue of identity. I don't know if I'm exceeding my time here. Let me just check this quickly. I hope none of you are bored here. Okay, so let's talk about the issue of identity. Now, I could take the approach of giving you a long theological discourse on the meaning of identity, and then qualify what Islamic identity is. And that's not unimportant. We have to have a strong Quranic and prophetic basis for understanding who and what we are. And that discussion needs to take place at some point, but unfortunately it's not going to take place today by me. I'm just going to take sort of a more innovative, perhaps, but definitely a different approach to trying to understand the notion of identity within the context of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. I'm going to take an experiential approach, and I'm going to filter that through the Quran and the Sunnah, and then see if we can try to understand the notion of identity within the context of the Islamic Revolution in Iran restoring the Islamic identity. And so I'm going to refer to some public statements that have been made recently by some prominent Muslims. And these statements, they were made some weeks ago, I think near the end of 2016. And I'm sure that you're well aware of these statements. If you've paid any attention to the news, I'm sure that you heard of them. I'm not going to mention any names. I don't want to disrespect anyone. But nonetheless, this is going to help us with this as a backdrop, it's going to help us understand the notion of identity insofar as it pertains to the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and then by extension, insofar as it pertains, to who and what we are. So these statements, and I'll just go through a couple of them. They were made again by Muslims who are prominent, I guess, on the American scene, insofar as representing Islam in the public in a scholarly fashion. And these statements were made with regard to the sort of extrajudicial murders by law enforcement personnel of unarmed African Americans. And so one of these prominent personalities, he said, and I typed this out so that I wouldn't make any mistakes in quoting him. The United States is, in terms of its laws, one of the least racist societies in the world. We have some of the best anti-discriminatory laws on the planet. I think it's very dangerous to just broad stroke any police that shoots a black as immediately being considered a racist. And then there were some other statements that were made with regard to the same issue and the reaction of the Black Lives Matter movement, to these murders. So another Muslim scholar, preacher, he made statements to the effect that Muslims have a responsibility to be just. The obvious implication being that we shouldn't jump to conclusions about the killers and the murderers. They may not be racists, and so we should take everything on a case-by-case basis. And wherever justice takes us, then that's where we ought to be, in a sense. That was his statement on the issue, basically. My objective, again, and I want to clarify this so that there's no misunderstanding. My objective in citing these statements is not to criticize these personalities. The good that they've done far outweighs any indiscretions that they might have done. And, I view this to be a political indiscretion. And in the case of the former statement, the first statement that I just read out to you, that particular scholar he retracted that statement, and then he reframed it in a different way. Now, I don't know if that was because of the pressure that he received because of the original statement that he made, but as I'm saying, that this scholar and the other scholars, the good that they've done far outweighs any indiscretions that they may have made, and through their effort, to be fair to the topic, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people have become Muslims. So my objective is not to criticize them, and my objective is not to take pot shots at other Islamic figures. My objective here is to try to explain the statement that I made in the very beginning, that the Islamic Revolution restored the Islamic identity. And this anecdotal information is going to help me rationalize the point that I'm trying to make, and in this particular case with regard to identity. Once these statements were made, the reaction to these statements was polarized along racial lines. And again, most of us familiar with the controversy, we know that. African Americans who reacted to the statement suggested that the scholar ought to be better informed about the situation and the condition of African Americans, especially with regard to their relationship to law enforcement, and that if he was better informed, that his statements would have been more nuanced. Insofar as the opinion of the European converted population, basically white people who became Muslims, or the immigrant population, they basically took an approach of trying to defend the scholar and his statements, and with a view to helping people to help other people understand what he really meant. And so so that's insofar as that's concerned. The reason it's germane to us and why it's important to this talk is that it's going to help me establish a point. And before I establish my point, I want to go into the background of this whole controversy just a little bit. So I want to sort of fill in the blanks a little bit. Insofar as law enforcement in the United States is concerned, one of the biggest future terror threats that the FBI perceives is going to be a huge problem. And it's not going to be too far into the future. They perceive that within the next 10, 20, 30 years, this is going to be a very big problem in the United States, and they already regard it to be a very big problem. That to such an extent, in the same way that the FBI is trying to infiltrate masjids, that they're informants in all the masjids, basically, that they're FBI informants in white nationalist, white supremacist, and white racist militia groups all across the country. And the reason that this presents a real problem for the United States is that these white racist, white supremacist groups, some of them call themselves sovereign citizens, and you should go home and look up that term, sovereign citizens. They have infiltrated law enforcement in U.S. cities and in U.S. rural areas, to such an extent that the percentage of white racists and white supremacists in U.S. law enforcement, depending on where you are, is 1 out of 4 all the way up to 1 out of 2. So if you're in the rural areas, as much as 50% of the law enforcement personnel are white racists, white supremacists, or what have you, whatever sort of goes by that designation. And if you're in a city like Los Angeles or Chicago or New York or something like that, it's as high as 1 out of 4. So 1 out of every law enforcement officers in a major city could belong to, or his sympathies could belong to a white racist or a white nationalist group in the United States. Now, in the US military, up to 30% of the soldiers are considered by the FBI to belong to white racist and white nationalist groups. Now, this is a problem. These people are armed. They have a racist mentality. And obviously, from what we've seen in the streets, they're dangerous. And again, the FBI perceives this to be a major, major problem in the United States. Second is the issue of asset seizures by the federal government and by local authorities in the United States. Asset seizures are related to the property of people who have been either accused of drug crimes or of terrorism-related crimes. Now, mind you, I'm saying they've been accused, they've never been indicted, and they've never been convicted in a court of law. But just because they've been accused, there are regulations on the books that enables or authorizes the federal government or local authorities to go in and seize all of their assets. And those assets could be property, they could be money, it could be, what have you. Last year alone, $5 billion in asset seizures took place in the United States. This exceeds the ordinary theft and burglary in the United States, which was only $3.8 billion. Which in a sense makes the federal government the largest thief in the United States. Forget about taxes. So now we have a militia which is armed and dangerous. We have law enforcement which is armed and dangerous. And we have the authority which is commanding the law enforcement officers which is armed and dangerous. The thing of it is that black people know all this. They've been experiencing it for the past 70, 80, 90 years. They know all of this. This is not new information to them. And if there was an African American brother or sister that was here, they would tell you, yeah, we know all of this. The problem is that the immigrant Muslims, they don't know this. And hence, you see some of the statements that have been made in the media. Okay, so with this background, let me read this statement again, and then I'm going to make the point that I need to make. The United States, in terms of its laws, The United States is, in terms of its laws, one of the least racist societies in the world. We have some of the best anti-discriminatory laws on the planet. I think it's very dangerous to just broad stroke any police that shoots a black as immediately being considered a racist. Now, this kind of argument has been deconstructed before. Unfortunately, because most of us Muslims are not very well informed either of civil rights history in the United States, the history of slavery in the United States, the history of the abuse of minorities in the United States. This kind of statement has been deconstructed before, and so I'm going to present to you 3 of the counter arguments against this kind of a statement. The first argument is one that's proposed by Howard Zinn, and he's a rather famous counterculture historian. And he says that there's a difference between the rights you have on paper and the rights you have in fact. The rights you have on paper obviously are related to, the Constitution or Magna Carta or what have you. These are the rights that are written down by a combination of authorities. It could be a king, it could be a president that represents, a certain body of people. But, the rights of the people are, recorded in writing, and, they're widely disseminated. But this doesn't mean that if you have rights on paper, that you can freely exercise those rights on the ground. And the point that he makes is that for rights on paper to translate into rights in fact, it depends on the leaders of that society. And if the leaders are sincere and honest to their responsibility, then the rights on paper translate very effectively to rights on the ground. But if they're not, which is the case in the majority of the world, then the rights on the ground or the rights in fact don't really have any meaning. And you can see that in a country like the United States, it really thrives on the notion of the Constitution. That you have all of these rights on paper, and it really sort of runs a long way in sort of getting the world to try to understand, how progressive it is in the delineation of rights. But if you hold it to account with regard to the rights in fact, it has a very poor record to stand on. In fact, it probably won't even be able to stand on that record. In this regard, if you take a look at Islamic Iran, we understand that the leadership there is honest, it's true to its responsibilities. And just recently, a mayor was elected in a small principality of this province of Sistan, Balochistan. It's the first female mayor in the country. She's only 26 years old, and she's a Sunni. It's important. In the United States, again as an example, yours truly here, I was coming across the border from Canada back to the United States. I had gone to attend a Gaza convention in Canada. I spoke there. It was a fundraiser. And so I was coming back, driving across the border, coming back into the United States. And for me, it's just routine to get pulled aside, for secondary questioning. It normally takes anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. On this particular occasion, it took 3 hours. And they had to call in a special agent from somewhere to come in and interrogate me. But one of the things that he said is that on the border of the United States of America, you have no constitutional rights. He said the Constitution doesn't apply on the border of the United States. So I want you to sort of really keep this in mind, that rights on paper don't necessarily translate into civil liberties on the ground. No matter how much legislation you may enact, the expansion of law does not necessarily translate into the expansion of civil liberties on the ground. The second argument, the second counter-argument against this particular statement was one advanced by Stokely Carmichael, later to be known as Kwame Ture. He said that, and he was referring to, of course, civil rights legislation, but it may as well apply to the general topic of anti-discriminatory legislation. He said that civil rights legislation applies to white people, not black people. Now that's just the opposite of what everybody, is thinking. That everybody's thinking that, of course, civil rights legislation is meant for black people. So he said no. Civil rights legislation applies to white people. And so upon being asked why, he said, look, I'm born free. I don't need some legislator to tell me that I'm equal to somebody else. I was endowed with whatever rights I have by my God. Nobody gives them to me, and therefore nobody can take them away. This civil rights legislation is meant for those people who have the desire to dispossess free people of their rights. And therefore, civil rights legislation applies to white people, not to black people. And once again, we make the point that an expansion of law, in this case civil rights legislation, doesn't necessarily mean that social attitudes and the social morality toward God is all of a sudden going to change. Law has to follow a deconstruction of the causes that led to discrimination to begin with. The law only protects that. The law doesn't initiate that. That's the point that he's making. You can have all the law you want, but as long as you don't change the social attitude of racism, it's not going to change the situation on the ground. The third counter-argument, to sort of deconstruct this statement, is related to the proper place of law to begin with in society. How much law should you have? How little should it be? How much should it be? What's the size of government? How big should it be? How small should it be? How intrusive should it be in the lives of the people, and so on and so forth. Now, with this particular argument, it makes the case that the expansion of law, if you look at societies in history, and if you see a society that's enacting more and more laws, that generally indicates that that society is not a stable society. That society is heading towards destruction. And so the more that you see the expansion of law, the more it suggests that the people can't control themselves. And so you have to enact more and more laws in order to control the behavior of the people. Now, in order to try to sort of really understand this, let me give you an example out of the insurance world. Insurance, any kind of insurance, it functions on the principle that all bad things don't happen at once. And so, for instance, if you had automobile insurance, to have a membership in the program, everybody who wants to become a member, they contribute a certain amount of their income or savings every given period of time, say every month. And so now that you've become a member of this program, if anybody in that program, if any member gets into an accident, then the money which is accrued by the monthly contributions of all the other members will go towards repairing the damage of that accident. You know, if his vehicle is damaged, then all that money that has been piling up in an escrow account or in a pot, call it a pot, then some of that will be taken to contribute towards the repairs of that person's vehicle. Now that can only function if all the members are not getting into accidents simultaneously. If all of them got into an accident simultaneously, there's not enough money to fix all the cars. And so the basic rule of thumb is that all bad things don't happen at the same time. This is the major problem with healthcare in the United States. All bad things are happening at the same time. Too many people are getting too sick, and they're getting sick at a very early age. And there's not enough money by the premiums that people contribute into the system to fix all of the problems. And it's the same thing with law. That if you find that a particular law or set of laws are being continuously violated to such an extent that the judges in that society have such a large caseload they can't deal with everything, that suggests that there's a deeper pathology that the inaction of more laws is not going to help. Okay. So going through that development, I know that it was a long development, but I thank you for being patient through this logic. The point that has to be made here is that all of these counter-arguments are Islamic. And we defined Islamic just a little while ago. I'm not talking about Islamic in the exclusive sense, in the sense of, you know, people praying a certain amount of time, certain number of times during the day, or fasting Ramadan or so. I'm talking about Islam in the generic sense, in the lowercase Islam sense. All of these counter-arguments that were made against the particular statement that I read are Islamic. And the reason that they're Islamic is because any principled opposition to tyranny, to oppression, to the concentration of power, to the concentration of wealth, are in the models of prophets, and therefore they're Islamic. So if you have a principled opposition, and you have a principled position in the model of prophets, then that statement, or those arguments, are considered to be Islamic. The germane thing here is that the Islamic Revolution, obviously most of these counter-arguments were made by non-Muslims. In fact, all of these particular counter-arguments that I've quoted here by Howard Zinn, by Stokely Carmichael, and by others, they're all non-Muslims. But insofar as the Islamic Revolution in Iran is concerned, the way that it represents Islamic, it's found a way to include principled non-Muslims in its domain of actions. Now, I'm trying to broaden your mind with regard to what the meaning of Islamic and identity means. Okay, so you might say that, how can you say that? How can you say that, Islamic Iran has, found a way to include non-Muslims? After all, these people who are posing these counter-arguments, they're not known to have taken the Shahada. And they made their arguments well before the inception of the Islamic Revolution. And so, this is how I would respond to that. Their arguments belong to a certain culture. The counter-arguments that these people like Howard Zinn and Stokely Carmichael made, they belong to a certain culture. And that is a culture of opposition to tyranny, to oppression, to corruption, to designating authority where it doesn't belong. And in the world today, the leading advocate of that culture of opposition, the loudest voice in that culture of opposition is Islamic Iran. And as such, it can appropriate that entire developmental history of the culture of opposition and own it for itself. And to this end, if you take a look at the Islamic Republic of Iran, it has withstood all manner of assault and opposition. It has withstood and stood up firm after 38 years of economic sanctions, after years and years of military aggression, out of 4 decades of demonization in the media. And it has stood up with courage and with principle. In fact, its courage is so infectious that it has inspired resistance movements all around the world, either directly or indirectly. All the way from Hezbollah to Occupy Wall Street. Directly or indirectly inspired by the courage that the Islamic Revolution in Iran has demonstrated against inimical forces. Forces that claim to be superpowers, hyperpowers, global powers, more powerful than at any other time in the history of man. And the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Islamic people of Iran have stood against that with courage and with principle. Egypt can't say that. Pakistan can't say that. Indonesia can't say that. For that matter, the United States can't say that. The European Union can't say that. The Zionist State of Israel can't say that. Saudi Arabia can't say that. Again, this is very important because I really want you to understand the meaning of Islamic identity. This culture of opposition that is framed by the Islamic identity, it has a past, it has a present, and it has a future. And the Islamic Revolution in Iran is bridging seamlessly that past with its future. And this is the Islamic identity. Brothers and sisters, we are winning the war of ideas. Regardless of what the military balance of power in the world is, we are winning the war of ideas. Our ideas are new. They're fresh. They respond to the needs of the mustad'afin. They're indisputable. They're unimpeachable. They cannot be denied. And this means that the future belongs to us. The shape of the future is in our hands. يُرِيدُونَ لِيُطْفِئُوا نُورَ اللَّهِ بِأَفْوَاهِهِمْ وَاللَّهُ مُتِمُّ نُورِهِ وَلَوْ كَرِهَ الْكَافِرُونَ هُوَ الَّذِي أَرْسَلَ رَسُولَهُ بِالْهُدَى وَدِينِ الْحَقِّ لِيُظْهِرَهُ عَلَى الدِّينِ كُلِّهِ وَلَوْ كَرِهَ الْمُشْرِكُونَ وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.